All eyes are on Rafah, the media's included. It was a topic on today's instalment of the BBC's Politics Live, and one of the panellists was Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry. She and Conservative MP Paul Scully were both asked what could be done to prevent the Israelis going ahead with an offensive in Rafah. They said this.
There's more than 1 million people and more than half of them are children. Anything that the Israelis are doing around Rafah is going to result, unless they're really careful, in the deaths of innocent people. And what is the reason for this? If there's a potential peace process happening, then our concern is, not only have we been saying for I don't know how long that they must not go into Rafah, but to go in now, when potentially there might be a peace process. Hamas has agreed to, some pretty major concessions, and they need to sit down and they need to talk. And the rest of the world is putting every effort they can into diplomacy, into putting pressure on Israel. Israel really needs to listen.
I think what we've got to do is to make sure that we are continuing to talk to Israel, to make sure that they are continuing to talk in these the peace talks, and that's my understanding that is what they are doing, to make sure that they are there at the table. We don't want to see any more bloodshed. We don't want to see any more bombing from our pictures that we're seeing from here. But we've also got to remind Israel of their responsibilities. That yes, Rafah is the last Hamas stronghold, and my understanding is that when they closed off the area yesterday, it was because rockets were coming. There was a few rockets fired in from that particular area, and I suspect what's happening. Hamas will clearly be wanting to put the pressure up now, saying we've signed up to this deal, because otherwise they want to put the pressure back on Israel.
If you're following that, essentially they both said, well, the world's doing what it can, and Israel just needs to be very careful and listen. Powerful stuff from our elected representatives. However, Novara Media's Ash Sarkar was also on the Politics Live panel, and she had a very different take.
I'm sat across from two very, very intelligent people, and unfortunately, the way you're talking is treating people like mugs. You can talk about condemnation all you want. You can talk about reminding Israel of their international obligations all you want. But until you're talking about suspending arms sales to Israel, until the Americans are talking about suspending military aid to Israel, all of that finger wagging in the world will not stop Netanyahu from doing what he wants to do, which is launching an absolutely terrible, abhorrent ground assault on Rafah. The images which are coming out on social media at the moment have been for months from Rafah of children buried under the rubble, body parts blown to smithereens. This is the result of Israel being emboldened and effectively being given a carte blanche to interpret its, in Emily's words from October 2023, its absolute right to self-defense to mean collectively punishing the Gazan people.
Ash was referencing comments there made by Emily Thornberry on Newsnight on the 12th of October 2023. Thornberry, a human rights barrister, was asked by host Victoria Derbyshire whether she believed that Israel cutting off food, water and electricity to Gaza was them acting within international law. Spoiler, it's considered collective punishment. Thornberry responded saying, quote, I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism. That remark came after Keir Starmer had earlier that day made very similar comments. On today's broadcast of Politics Live, Thornberry was invited to respond to what Ash said. Here's her reply.
2 days, 3 days after the first incursions into Israel, when so many people had been killed and there were so many hostages that had been taken, and we were in a live situation.
Well, and there are still hostages.
And we believed, but they were, but it was still, there was still fighting going on the ground in Israel. And there were, as far as I understood, there was going to be an attempt to get the hostages back. At that stage, just cut the lights off and so on was the right thing to do. But as I said at the time, and there has been some selective reporting, it absolutely is not within international law to cut off supplies to a nation. So
you were asked specifically about food and water,
yes,
not just the lights.
Yes,
and you said Israel has an absolute right to defend itself.
And as I also said, as the guy from the UN had said before, I'm sorry for people who hadn't seen the program, but for the person who was from the UN who was on Newsnight before me had said, within a short period in a war, you can cut off in order to. So essentially, if they were going to go into Gaza to try and get the hostages back, then in that very short period, then it would be right to kind of, and we know that's what Israel has been doing on and off in Gaza anyway. But in this period, that was the thing to do, not to do it so that you starve people and not to do it so that you cut off their power so that they don't have water. That's, you do it in a short period when you're defending yourself because you have an absolute right to defend yourself. And that's the right thing to do. But it always had to be, as we always said, within the confines of international law.
So hang on. It's okay to do a little siege, a little bit of collective punishment, as long as it's short. It might be painful, but so long as it's short, it's fine. Is that what international law says? Because that is the sticking point, isn't it, as well? Labour's shadow cabinet has parroted the line continuously that Israel has to act within international law. Yet they've been really extremely slow to actually acknowledge the extensive actions taken by Israel since October 2023 that seem certain to have violated those same laws. And while simultaneously refusing to give institutional backing to concrete policy demands, such as arms embargoes, such as, a refugee scheme for Palestinians in Gaza, that could put pressure on Israel not to break international law. Well, here's how Ash responded to Thornberry's remarks.
I think that's a bit like saying, I want to burgle this house, but in a lawful way. I think these two things are completely contradictory.
It's you've got my stuff in your house, and I'm going in to get it.
And the last thing that I would say is, I think it is for the birds, the idea that you could not see what would be happening now. What was coming out from Israel in terms of politicians' mouths, the references to Amalek, saying that there are no uninvolved civilians, even in those very, very early days, it was clear that civilians were being considered fair targets. So then when you've got leading politicians saying that the right to self-defense includes cutting off food, includes cutting off water and power, that either means that you were unable to see what millions of other people could see was going to happen, which would make me question the quality of the politicians we have in this country, or there's an element of being disingenuous, where you didn't think you had the political room to say this at the start, but now you're worried about the images coming out.
Okay, so may I answer that? So I think within the short period of the first few days, when they were trying to get their hostages back, I think that is one thing. And as things move on, we have been completely clear about what it is that we expect. We expect there to be a ceasefire. It is not necessary for Israel to continue in this way. Israel had an absolute right to defend itself, but now there needs to be an immediate ceasefire. And we have made that clear.
Would you suspend arms sales?
I'll answer that question.
Okay. So what I would say is this, is that when we look at some of the images, and I can't sit here in this television studio or in London and decide on a case-by-case basis on whether there has been a breach of international law here or there or whatever instances, but as a whole, one begins to really be concerned that there may well be some breaches of international law. And if that is right, then what we need to do, and listen, I've been doing this a long time. I did this when we were arming Saudi Arabia in Yemen. And what you do is you look at what arms are being sold. Are they being used, British arms are being sold, are they being used in the conflict? And is there a breach of international law? Now, we can see what seems to be on the face of it, breaches of international law. The question then is, what arms are we selling and are they being used? And that's quite a difficult and a technical thing that needs to be done. And that's why we want to see the advice.
Right.
So that we can see the stages that have been gone through to see whether or not we are selling arms that are being used in breach of international law.
Emily is right. You do have to sit down and carefully consider the evidence. But why have Labour been so reluctant and slow to consider the evidence from the beginning? That what Israel has done to Gaza goes far beyond any right to self-defense, or that Israel may not even have had that mandate in the first place because Gaza is an occupied territory. The only answer seems to be that it took an incredible and devastating amount of Palestinian deaths in order to trigger the sort of wringing of political hands that we have seen present from the very beginning with, say, the Russian occupation of Ukraine. Sanctions slapped on Russia immediately. But with Israel, no. We're still, X amount of months on, more than 200 days since this started, we're still saying, well, they just need to think carefully when they're dropping their bombs. They just need to think very carefully when they're shredding children. Mike, what do you make of that exchange and Emily Thornberry's change in position and attempt to rewrite her former statements?
I think Labour, Starmer, Thornberry, whoever it might be, they're trying to gaslight us. We have the tapes, we have the footage. we know what you said. We have it in 4K, guys. Let's be guided here and be responsible, because you can't just pivot now because it suits you, because you look better now that you're pivoting now, because, so many people have died. Oh, we have to pivot now. No, your words carry weight. And what happened, as Ash has said, is the words by Labour, and Labour constantly at the start of this, simply parroted the line, Israel has the absolute right to defend itself. In any interview, that was a line being said by David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary. Emily Thornberry had been sent out to say the same line. Keir Starmer said it several times, including in that infamous LBC interview. So we can't now pivot and say, no, we didn't say that. It's not, what we meant was this. No, we know what you meant, because at the time as well, they were being pushed on this and they were consistently parroting the same line. It's only now it's becoming less politically expedient for them to parrot this line, but they've now resorted to kind of finger-wagging and vacuous calls for justice and peace, right? But what's happened is Labour have consistently been on the wrong side of the story throughout this. And the idea that what's happened in Gaza is completely we couldn't have predicted this, is nonsense, because senior Israeli politicians were using extremely dehumanizing language. At the time in October, they were using language referring to Palestinians as animals, right? Dehumanizing them completely. So the idea that that language wouldn't resort in complete and utter brutality is a nonsense. So I'm not buying Labour's attempts to pivot, its attempts to gaslight us. It's frankly insulting to our intelligence when we saw the tapes and we saw the footage and we saw what they were saying. And I think Labour are now realising, we're losing a few voters, and we can't actually really just say Israel has the right to defend itself when tens of thousands of people have died and tens of thousands of people have been injured. They can't just parrot that line. They have to pivot to this kind of vacuous, it's terrible what's happening in Rafah, and, let there be peace and a ceasefire, this kind of vacuous language they're using. And as said, a ceasefire for me is the start of the claims. What we need to think about is divesting from Israel, arms embargoes, really strong demands, welcoming Palestinians into our nation, those who may be fleeing and those who are suffering. That's what we need to be speaking about. This really, progressive thinking about the issue, rather than this kind of vacuous, words. And I think words, in some ways, yes, it's good that Labour are now calling for a ceasefire, but we need more than words, because we're at a stage now where this is a matter of life and death. So Israel needs to know that there are consequences for violating international law, and especially to the extent that they're violating international, there needs to be consequences. And Labour, if they are the centre-left party they claim to be, a party that care about human rights, a party that care about justice, they need to be at the vanguard, at the forefront of those claims for justice. Will they be? Probably not, unless the US pivot from their position. Then I imagine if Biden does so, then Starmer will do so too, right? That's kind of how it works, isn't it? So I'm not convinced by this kind of gaslighting by Labour. It's not going to convince voters either, I don't think. It's a load of nonsense. We saw the tapes, we saw the footage. You can't fool us.
I think that's an extremely incisive analysis of the situation. And I want to pick on that comment that you made about, they said we wouldn't know what happened. They were pretending like they couldn't foresee what would happen. Well, I remember very clearly the days after the 7th of October, and I'm terrible at making predictions. I am bad at foreseeing political futures. It is not my forte. But on the 9th of October, I, with hundreds of other people, was outside the Israeli embassy because they'd already started the bombardment of Gaza, and we knew what was going to happen. We knew then, because we knew what was going to happen to the civilian population, because obviously there were horrific attacks upon the Israeli population, but we knew what the price of that would be for the Palestinian population in Gaza, because when you have a ghettoized population who live in an apartheid state, they've been stripped of rights, they've been demonized by this much more powerful military state next door, who have long tried to push them completely out of the territory and have committed ethnic cleansing for the last 78 years. And then you have an extreme right-wing government, the furthest right-wing government possible. It was obvious from the very get-go what on earth was going to happen to those people.